hope you're doing well. Today I am going to be talking about the books that I read in July. I started off the month by reading The Edible Woman by Margaret Atwood. This is actually Margaret Atwood's first published novel, and there's a little introduction at the beginning of the copy of the book that I read that said that she wrote this book in sort of the mid-60s, but it took a little while for her to get the book published. It also said that she wrote this book when she was about the age of 24, and that some of the themes in the book she thought were a little bit immature, looking back on it as an older lady. But as I'm almost 24, I think I actually enjoyed this book because of my age and because of the age she was when she wrote it, because it gives this really interesting insight into, I guess, a younger, less experienced Margaret Atwood. The protagonist of The Edible Woman is a lady called Marion. She is recently graduated from university and she's currently working at a company that conducts surveys. She also has a boyfriend and eventually fiance, Peter, and she's rooming with another girl called Ainsley. This story is basically about Marion rebelling against the social norms that are expected of her. Her family all really want her to get married, and even though she's agreed to marry Peter, it's not really something that she really wants. But at that time, she sees her only alternative is to continue working at the job that she doesn't really like and ending up being a middle-aged spinster, which is also seen as a abhorrent thing to be in that society. Her rejection of social norms manifests in her not being able to eat food. She starts off not being able to eat meat because she's connecting the steak that she's eating with the body of a cow and therefore connecting that with herself. And there are a lot of metaphors throughout the book about women's bodies being something consumable and something to possess. I found this book really fascinating in that it is very obviously a product of its time, and yet still I found a lot of things really relevant to today, and I found myself identifying with a lot of Marion's thoughts and opinions. I finally finished off a book I've been reading for ages, which is The Life of Charlotte Bronte by Elizabeth Gaskell. I think I started reading this in March, and I've just kind of been reading bits of it in between other books. This is a biography of Charlotte Bronte, published 2 years after her death, and Elizabeth Gaskell actually knew Charlotte Bronte when she was alive, so it offers a more personal look at Charlotte Bronte's life. I like that Gaskell included a lot of Charlotte's letters, and so we get to hear direct from Charlotte and get to hear her voice. But obviously you have to keep in mind that Elizabeth Gaskell was trying to make Charlotte Bronte's life acceptable to Victorians, and so probably smoothed over certain sections of the book. She definitely makes assumptions about what might have happened in Charlotte's life, and she's obviously curating the bits of the letters that she wants to include. The bits I liked the most in this book was when Charlotte in her letters was writing about literary works of the time and critiquing them, and talking about her interactions with famous authors of the era and her visits to London. I think if you're a massive Bronte fan or a massive Gaskell fan, or really just like reading stuff written in the Victorian era, then you would enjoy this. But I think if you're looking for a more comprehensive book on Charlotte's life, it would probably be better to pick up one of the more contemporary biographies. The next book I read was actually also non-fiction, and it was Fight Like a Girl by Clementine Ford. Clementine Ford is a very well-known feminist writer in Australia. She writes lots of articles and she has a very prominent Facebook page and other social media platforms that she uses to talk about feminism. So this book is divided into different chapters, each containing, I guess, a mini essay about feminism. I really like the bits at the beginning of the book that were about Clementine's personal experiences. It's always really interesting to read about how individual people discovered feminism and how differently people can experience all the societal pressures and stereotypes that get pushed upon women growing up. However, as the book goes on, Clementine starts talking more about the internet trolls that she receives on a daily basis. Anyone following her on her Facebook page would know that she receives a lot of dreadful emails and Facebook messages from men just calling her the most vile of names and in the most abhorrent language. And she uses this language a lot to describe herself in a satirical way to make those words meaningless and disempower the effect that the men are trying to have on her by calling her those names. Unfortunately, she does this so much in the book that I found it really a bit tedious and a bit awful to read through. It's obviously so awful that she receives these messages so constantly, but I think she didn't have to use that language throughout the whole book to make that point. I came away from the book feeling like I hadn't really learnt anything new, so it's probably more of a book for younger readers. The next book I read was The Watcher in the Garden by Joan Phipson. This is part of the Text Australian Classics series and is a young adult book published in 1982. This tells the story of Kitty. She's a teenager and she has this temper that will rise up out of her out of nowhere, and so she retreats to this neighborhood garden, which is this huge beautiful garden with a mansion sitting on it. She goes to retreat to this garden to get away from everything, and the old man who lives in the house discovers it and they sort of strike up a friendship. This is a really strange sort of magical realism type book. Reading it, I instantly thought that it must be set in the Blue Mountains where I used to live, because the description of the bush was so accurate to the Blue Mountains, and there is nowhere else in Australia that is like the Blue Mountains. And then I read that actually the garden in the book is based off the Everglades home and garden in Laura, which is right at the top of the Blue Mountains and is a place I've actually visited. So it was cool to have that personal connection to the story. I think I would have enjoyed this more as a teenager. Reading it now, it felt a little bit juvenile. I found it quite repetitive in its storytelling, and the plot relied a lot on the magical realism, and it wasn't really convincing enough for me to believe in the story. The next book I read was Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. I decided to reread this series because the BBC is finally making a TV adaptation of the series. I can't remember whether I've read this once or twice before, but I remember the story of this one the most, probably because of seeing the film. Not that the film is any good at all. So I went into this book thinking I'd probably remember most of the story, but I had to read it so I could read the other two in the series. However, there was actually quite a bit that I had forgotten and also didn't really understand when I first read these when I was a young teenager. There's a lot of references to religion in the book, and I, not knowing anything about religion, did not get any of the references at all. Even the sort of Adam and Eve type references that are very clearly there. The story is about a girl called Lyra. She lives in a world that's similar but still very different to ours, and she is an orphan living in Oxford, being looked after by all the scholars there. Her uncle Lord Asriel visits the college, and he sets in motion a sequence of events that lead her to leave the college, which eventually leads her to travel north to the Aurora, hence the title Northern Lights. What I think is great about this series, particularly the first book, I think, is that there's a lot of pretty in-depth stuff about science and religion, and you can just really enjoy the adventure of it. It's incredibly exciting. It's a real page turner. The world that Philip Pullman has created is so vivid and so real because he has so cleverly taken things that are real in our world and just sort of twisted them and changed them a little bit so they feel like something completely new but also something really similar. If you haven't read the series, I would definitely recommend giving it a go, and I'm so excited for the prequel of this series that he's currently writing and 2 further sequels that he's also apparently writing as well. The last book I read in July was The Pigman by Paul Zindel. I picked this book up because one of my favourite YouTubers, Hayley Blay, said this was her favourite book, so I was curious to see what it was like. This is a story about 2 teenagers, John and Lorraine, and they, through a series of circumstances, end up meeting a man they call the Pigman. His name is Mr. Pignati, and he is sort of a lonely man whose wife has died, living alone in a house, and they befriend him. Again, I feel like this is a book I would have enjoyed as a young teenager. I enjoyed it for its nostalgic quality. It's written in 1968, and so it's always interesting to read young adult books from a previous time before young adult really became a thing. So those were all the books that I read in July. Let me know if you've read any of them, and let me know if you've read anything really good in July. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.